On the night of 1st July, in a city pulsing with 11 million restless lives, sirens wailed towards hospitals that almost all carried the same invisible signature, built, planned, or saved by one man. As ambulances cut through the darkness of Calcutta, people rushed into wards, into clinics, into medical colleges that existed because of him. And at that same hour, far from the noise of traffic and steel, the heart of the man who had once treated an entire province as his patient was quietly failing. He had spent a lifetime fighting for every extra day of someone else's life. Now time was finally refusing to negotiate. To understand how a soft-spoken Bengali doctor became powerful enough to rebuild a city and shape a state, you have to go back to a much smaller room in a much smaller town, where a frightened boy watched his first patient die and could do absolutely nothing. Bidhan Chandra Roy was born on 1st July 1882 in Patna, then a dusty, heat-struck town in the Bengal Presidency of British India. His father, Durgadas Roy, was a railway engineer, precise, disciplined, a man who believed in straight lines and straight answers. His mother, Agorkamini Devi, was his opposite, warm, devout, endlessly generous, the kind of woman who would give away the last handful of rice to a stranger at the door and then laugh when her children asked what they would eat. Their house was not large, but it was full of books, of songs from the Brahmo Samaj meetings, of whispered conversations about justice and God and the strange new things the British were doing in distant Calcutta. Money was tight. Durgadas's salary was just enough to keep the family's head above water. Every wasted coin, every idle minute felt like a betrayal of the future. One afternoon, as hot wind pressed against the windows like a living thing, little Bidhan came home to a scene that would not leave him for the rest of his life. A neighbor's child had collapsed with a fever. There was no doctor in time. No medicines, only a frantic mother pouring water onto a burning forehead, waiting for a miracle that never came. By the time anyone with knowledge arrived, the child was gone. The room smelled of sweat, incense, and helplessness. Later that night, Durgada sat his son down. "Remember this," he told him, voice low but unyielding. "Ignorance kills as surely as any weapon. If you wish to be anything in this world, be precise. Be useful. Build. Do not destroy." In that moment, the idea that a man could fight death not with guns but with knowledge lodged itself deep in the boy's mind. He grew up shy, serious, sometimes maddeningly stubborn. While other children played, he sat in corners, absorbed in books that were too thick for his age. The world outside their door was changing. Railways snaking across the continent, British officials in stiff uniforms, whispers of revolt carried on train platforms. But inside, the rules were simple. Study, serve, do not waste time. Time. From the beginning, time was the invisible rival in his life. The hours his father counted by candlelight as he measured out how much schooling they could afford. The minutes his mother spent telling him stories before sending him back to his desk. He would learn to hear the ticking of unseen clocks long before he wore a watch. At Patna Collegiate School, the boy from the modest railway household began to attract attention. He devoured mathematics, literature, science. Teachers noticed his memory, his precision. But brilliance did not shield him from humiliation. British staff sometimes mocked the accents of Indian boys, their clothes, their dreams. Their message was smooth, poisonous. People like you do not lead. You serve. Every cruel smile, every casually racist remark cut deep and then hardened into resolve. He graduated to Patna College, then one of the few paths for an Indian youth to reach higher education. The college courtyard was a world inside a world. Debate circles where students argued about nationalism, pamphlets secretly passed. Under desks, harsh notices on walls warning against seditious gatherings. Here, for the first time, young Bidhan felt another kind of tension, different from the pressure to pass exams. Was knowledge just for personal advancement? Or was it a weapon to be wielded against the injustice he saw around him? He listened more than he spoke, but the questions stayed. By 1901, his academic performance had given him a choice that felt like a fork in destiny. He could continue on a safer, more traditional path, perhaps law, perhaps the civil service, or he could do the thing that had haunted him since that day in the neighbor's house, become a doctor. Medicine was not just difficult. Under British rule, it was filled with invisible glass ceilings for Indians. There were stories of brilliant local students being blocked from top posts, of being allowed to serve but not to lead. Friends advised caution. The British system, they warned, would always keep a brown doctor in his place. He chose medicine anyway. Calcutta Medical College, where he joined as a young student, was a world of sharp contrasts. Marbled corridors and faded imperial grandeur on one side, overcrowded wards filled with the poor and dying on the other. British professors strode through like minor gods, their white coats and clipped accents symbols of an authority that went far beyond anatomy or surgery. Indian students, even the brightest, lived with a quiet, grinding awareness. They were being judged every minute by standards not designed for them to win. In this crucible, a new kind of rivalry took shape in Bidhan's life. It wasn't against a single classmate or one professor. It was against the whole silent architecture of condescension, the unspoken assumption that an Indian mind was somehow a weaker instrument. Every time a British lecturer asked a question and looked past Indian students for answers, something in him tightened. He responded the only way he knew, by mastering everything. He spent nights hunched over textbooks, tracing diagrams of the human body until they almost seemed to breathe on the page. Classmates remembered him as precise, almost ascetic. No distractions, few social outings. The only thing that could pull him away from his desk was the hospital ward, the place where all theory shrank in the face of a gasping chest, a bloodied limb, a mother's eyes. When he passed his examinations with flying colors, it was a personal victory. But the system did not bend quickly. The posts of prestige, the senior positions, still seemed to go almost automatically to British doctors. There was praise, yes, respect sometimes, but always that invisible ceiling. If he wanted to truly master his craft, he realized he would have to fight the system from its own center. London. The very word was like a dare. In 1909, after years of grinding work, he put together the courage and the funds to apply for postgraduate training in England. His target was one of the hardest fortresses of British medical prestige, St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, known simply as Bart's. ART for an Indian to gain admission there was not just rare, it was almost unthinkable. His first application was rejected. The letter was polite, impersonal, devastatingly final. Thank you, no place. He applied again. Another rejection, another cold piece of paper crossing oceans to tell him he wasn't wanted. Most people would have stopped. His family certainly wanted him to. Money was nearly exhausted. Each application fee was like peeling skin off their already thin savings. But something in him that had grown hard in the classrooms of Patna and under the smirks of Calcutta refused to bend. He wrote a third time. He did not plead. He did not flatter. He simply presented his case with the same clarity he would one day use to diagnose a disease. His record, his determination, his performance already in India. He asked for a chance, not as a favor, but as a logical outcome. Somewhere in London, a dean who had dismissed 2 previous letters read the third and hesitated. The answer, when it finally arrived, felt like the first crack in a wall built over centuries. He was in. Getting there was a different battle. Durgata scraped together what he could. Furniture was sold. Comforts pared down to the bone. In the end, when they counted the notes on the table, it was brutally simple. They had enough to keep him abroad for about 3 years. No more. 3 years to crack some of the hardest exams in the world. 3 years to overcome not just the syllabus, but the snobbery, the loneliness, the homesickness, and the quiet, tightening racism of Edwardian England. 3 years before the money and his dream ran out. He landed in London into a world that was, in almost every sense, cold. The weather, of course. The damp that sank into his bones. The gray skies that seemed to press down on the city. But also the looks, the pauses. The way people's eyes slid briefly over his brown skin, his accent, and placed him silently into a lower category. At Bart's, the unspoken challenge was everywhere. Portraits of great British surgeons stared down from oak-paneled walls. Many of his fellow students, sons of the comfortable classes, had grown up with tutors, libraries, connections. He had arrived with 2 worn suitcases, a stack of books, and a clock ticking ruthlessly in his head. He rented the cheapest room he could find. Meals were stripped down to essentials. He walked long distances instead of taking trams. Every spare penny was hoarded for examination fees. While other students might indulge in pubs or theater, his night out was a second-hand anatomy atlas. But even here, in the heart of the empire, India would not leave him alone. In cramped lodgings and smoky back rooms, Indian students and exiles met to talk about something more dangerous than gallstones or tuberculosis: freedom. News of the partition of Bengal, of protests, boycotts, and speeches by men like Surendranath Banerjee crossed the seas in letters and newspapers. The air hummed with arguments. Some nights he sat silently in the corner as fiery nationalists denounced the British. "We have to tear the empire down," one would shout, fists slamming against the table. "Petitioning and pleading will never work. We need bold action now." Others, equally passionate, argued for gradual reform, for working inside the system. It was here that the first outline of his life's central conflict sharpened. On one side, medicine, the cool precision of science, the path of individual excellence. On the other, politics, chaos, passion, a fight that would consume not just his intellect but his entire being. For now, he chose to stay a doctor, but the idea that one day he might have to fight on both fronts, the hospital and the parliament, began to whisper to him. At Bart's, he did something that even among his peers was considered almost insane. He decided to prepare simultaneously for two of the toughest postgraduate qualifications: the membership of the Royal College of Physicians, MRCP, and the Fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons, FRCS. Physicians and surgeons were two different worlds, two different cultures, usually requiring years each. He had at most 3. Lecturers shook their heads. Friends warned him quietly. His unseen rival, time, ticked louder. The empire itself, in a way, seemed to be betting against him. An Indian mastering both disciplines in record time? Absurd. He worked as if no one had told him it couldn't be done. Nights bled into dawns. His fingers smelled constantly of ink and antiseptic. He dissected corpses with an almost fanatical attention, then washed and hurried back to his lodgings to cram neurology, pathology, physiology. Food lost all flavor. Sleep became a strategic resource, not a right. When the results came, they moved through the corridors like an electric shock. Bidhan Chandra Roy, the quiet Indian from Patna, had cleared both MRCP and FRCS in just a little over 2 years, a feat so rare that it began to travel as a rumor even outside medical circles. Some British colleagues congratulated him warmly, others with stiff, reluctant nods. But behind every handshake lay the same basic recognition. He had not merely passed. He had broken their expectations. For a moment, it seemed as if his life had resolved into a clean upward line. He could have stayed in England, built a comfortable career, enjoyed the respect that came with his new titles. The worst of the financial pressure was over. Offers would have come. Instead, he packed his suitcases again. India was calling, not romantically, not in some misty patriotic haze, but with the hard clarity of numbers. Millions of people, far too few doctors. Provinces where one trained physician might be responsible for tens of thousands of suffering bodies. In London, he would be one more expert in a crowded room. Back home, every skill he had might mean the difference between life and death. Not once, but thousands of times over. He returned to Calcutta in 1911, stepping off the ship into a city that seemed both familiar and utterly transformed. The skyline bristled with old colonial architecture and new nationalist energy. Tram bells clanged through streets where British policemen strutted and barefoot laborers trudged. Posters called for boycotts of foreign goods. Newspapers talked of strikes, arrests, speeches, sacrifices. He set up practice, first modestly, then with growing demand. Patients came not just for his medical acuity, but for something rarer: his attention. He listened. He remembered. He refused to turn poverty into a sentence. Many who had little or nothing found their bills quietly reduced or erased. Word spread. Yet as his clinic filled, so did his mind. Each day he moved between two worlds. In one, the antiseptic smell of the hospital, the crisp clink of instruments, the logic of diagnosis. In the other, the feverish chaos of a nation waking up. Protests, processions, police lothus, whispered stories of prisons and martyrs. He tried for a while to keep them apart, but history was not interested in his separation of duties. In 1916, a lean man in simple clothes arrived in Calcutta, the name on everyone's lips: Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. The lawyer who had challenged racism in South Africa was now turning his gaze fully on India, experimenting with a new weapon, non-violent resistance on a national scale. Their paths crossed. There is a story told and retold of how the young doctor and the emerging political leader first misjudged each other. When Gandhi initially came to Calcutta, Roy is said to have invited him to stay at his home. Gandhi, suspicious of comfort and wary of being co-opted by the city's elite, declined. But as he came to know more of the quiet physician who treated the poor without advertisement, he changed his mind and accepted hospitality later. Two men, seemingly opposite, one a surgeon of the body, the other determined to operate on the diseased organs of empire, began a cautious then deepening friendship. Gandhi, with his prophetic instinct, looked at Roy and saw not just a gifted doctor, but something more dangerous, a man who could translate moral ideals into practical systems. Hospitals, municipal councils, legislative reforms. The machinery a future Indian state would one day desperately need. Roy, for his part, looked at Gandhi and saw an entirely different kind of medicine. Here was a man who believed that an entire nation was sick, not only with foreign rule, but with its own divisions, castes, superstitions, fears. And his prescription was as radical as any surgery: satyagraha, non-cooperation, a refusal to obey unjust laws even at the cost of one's own safety. The question that had been quietly scratching at the edges of Roy's mind now pressed in with almost physical force. Was healing bodies enough when the entire social organism was diseased? News from across India sharpened the dilemma until it cut. In 1919 came the horror of Jallianwala Bagh. British troops opening fire on a peaceful gathering in Amritsar, hundreds killed. The ground reportedly soaked with blood. Pictures and reports filtered into Calcutta, into the same newspapers that carried advertisements for his medical services. Something in him snapped. He could no longer stand at a distance, a neutral observer in a white coat. There were, he realized, two kinds of doctors a country like India needed: those who stitched wounded flesh, and those who could perform surgery on the machinery of power. He decided to join the Indian National Congress. The moment he took that step, unseen lines shifted. New rivals appeared, not in exam halls, but in public meetings and committee rooms. In Bengal, factions were already forming: moderates and radicals, constitutionalists and revolutionaries. Among the younger generation, names would soon rise that would stand opposite his in election after election, on posters, in fiery editorial columns. One boy, then only a child, would one day become his sharpest political competitor: Syama Prasad Mukherjee, another brilliant Bengali. Another mind drawn to both public life and ideology, whose path would one day collide with Roy's in the battle over Bengal's soul. None of that had happened yet. For now, the doctor who had once been rejected 3 times by a London hospital stood at the edge of a new theater of struggle. Outside his clinic, crowds chanted slogans against British rule. Inside, stethoscope to chest, he measured heartbeats that quickened at the mention of freedom. Time, his oldest rival, was still ticking. A province was changing. A country was waking. And the man who had learned to race through exams and smash invisible ceilings was about to discover that the hardest operations of his life would not be performed in any hospital at all. The man who could stop a heart from failing with the right injection now found himself staring at a different kind of collapse, not of muscle and blood, but of a whole civilization's patience. In the operating theater, he could order time to pause. Nurse, adrenaline, now. In politics, the clock didn't listen. Deadlines came from London, riots from the streets, ultimatums from rivals. There were no anesthetics for a country on the verge of tearing itself apart. When Bidhan Chandra Roy walked out of his clinic and into the Indian National Congress, he did not resign from medicine. He tried something harder: to live 2 lives at once. Morning rounds in crowded wards, afternoons in legalistic committee rooms, nights in secret strategy meetings, poring over leaflets instead of case notes. To his patients, he was still Dr. B. C. Roy, calm, precise, the man whose presence at the bedside felt like a verdict in their favor. But increasingly, to party workers, he was Bidhan Babu, the intellect the Bengal Congress sent into battle whenever the British pushed some new, polished piece of injustice through the legislative machinery. Inside the Bengal Legislative Council, under the high ceiling and the cold gaze of colonial portraits, he faced a different kind of disease. Budgets that starved Indian education while feeding British institutions, ordinances that treated protest as pathology. His questions were a surgeon's tools, probing, cutting through fine phrases to expose infected motives underneath. Why? he demanded one afternoon, voice firm but low. Does the government always discover the need for law and order precisely when Indians discover their courage? Laughter from the Indian benches. Tight jaws on the government side. A warning glance from the president of the council. The British officials had thought the soft-spoken doctor would be easy to ignore. They were discovering their mistake. Outside, in the boiling lanes of Calcutta, politics didn't look like polite speeches. It looked like policemen charging into crowds, sticks cracking against backs, pamphlets ground into mud under boots. It looked like students dragged into vans like tricolors torn and trampled. On some evenings, Roy walked home from the council chambers past the very streets where, days earlier, volunteers had been beaten for selling coddies, the conflict that had once been abstract, heal bodies or heal the body politic, now arrived at his door in flesh and blood. One night during the non-cooperation movement, a young volunteer was brought to his clinic, skull split open, eyes barely responsive. He had been distributing leaflets near a government office. Someone had called the police. The result lay now on Roy's examination table, blood matting his hair. Will he survive? The boy's friend whispered. Roy didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because the real question was different and lodged like a bone in his throat. How many more of these can I stitch up, while the system that breaks them stays untouched? The more he worked in Congress, the clearer it became. His rival was no longer the anonymous British professor who doubted Indian ability. It was something larger, colder, more patient, an entire imperial machine that had perfected the art of waiting out rebellions. He saw how they used time as a weapon. Promise reforms, appoint a commission, study the question, delay, delay, delay. Let anger cool. Let leaders argue among themselves. And then, when the moment had passed, grant just enough concession to divide the opposition. It was a strategy any doctor would recognize. Let the fever drop just a little, so the patient thinks he is improving and never notices the deeper infection spreading inside. In 1928, when the Simon Commission arrived in India with not a single Indian member, anger exploded. Boycotts, black flags, processions. In Calcutta, as students chanted, "Simon, go back!" On College Street, Roy watched a generation younger than himself place their bodies between Lothus and principles. He knew some of the wounds that came limping into his clinic had been earned in those crowds. When Motilal Nehru's committee drafted a proposed Indian constitution, Roy was pulled into intense debates on what a future free India should look like, centralized or federal, secular or something else, how to balance provinces like Bengal with its combustible mix of communities. He argued quietly but firmly for something he would never stop believing in, that rights on paper meant nothing unless translated into systems, hospitals, municipalities, schools, housing boards. We cannot build freedom, he warned, on slogans alone. We must build the institutions that keep it alive on ordinary days. But the ordinary days were disappearing. By 1930, Gandhi had launched the civil disobedience movement. In Bengal, Congress leaders faced a choice: retreat into safe symbolic protest, or embrace real confrontation with a government that did not hesitate to imprison and crush. Roy, who had spent his life teaching himself discipline, now had to practice a different discipline, the willingness to let his own career, his comfort, even his freedom be subjected to an experiment in nonviolence. He courted arrest, spoke at banned meetings, signed resolutions that could send him to prison. When he was finally detained for his role in protests, the image must have seemed almost absurd to some British officials. A world-class physician trained at the finest London hospital, now behind bars like a common criminal. For Roy, the bars were not the most painful part. It was the knowledge that while he sat in a cell somewhere in Calcutta, a woman was whispering to a dying child, "If only Dr. Roy were here." Every day he was locked away. Time claimed new victims elsewhere. It felt like a cruel reversal. As a doctor, he had trained to snatch people back from the edge. As a politician, he had to accept that sometimes the fight for a different future required sacrifices in the present, including lives he might have saved. The British eventually released him, believing that cooling the temperature would fracture the movement. The larger movement did falter. Negotiations followed. Gandhi and the Viceroy met. But something irreversible had shifted inside Roy. He now understood that healer and fighter were not two roles to choose between, but two instruments he would have to play at once, often in dissonance. Then came a disaster that no jailer, no police station, no legislative debate could contain. In 1943, famine began to stalk Bengal. The reasons were cold and bureaucratic. Wartime requisitions of rice, disruption of trade, hoarding, administrative indifference. The consequences were biblical. In villages first, then in towns, then in Calcutta itself, bodies began to appear at dawn, on pavements, in station yards, at the edges of marketplaces. Skeleton-thin men and women, children with distended bellies, eyes already sunk into the skull. The city that worshipped Durga now saw another goddess walk its streets, a skeletal, merciless mother of hunger. Dr. Bidhan Chandra Roy, the physician-politician, found himself plunged into a nightmare that made every previous crisis look like rehearsal. Hospitals overflowed, clinics ran out of supplies. The problem was no longer just how to treat, it was what to treat first. Cholera, dysentery, sheer starvation. The line between medicine and politics dissolved completely. Policies about grain distribution were determining who lived, who died. He argued, pleaded, pushed in council and party meetings for stronger relief measures, for better logistics, for the use of every institutional muscle. The provincial government, led by Fazlul Huq and then others, lurched from denial to panic. The British, fighting a world war, treated Indian deaths as unfortunate statistics. One afternoon, after hours of seeing famine victims, Roy stepped outside a relief center and saw something that would never leave him. A mother, barely more than a bundle of bones herself, was trying to breastfeed a baby. There was no milk. The child's mouth moved mechanically, then slowed, then stopped. He knew in his head that he could not conjure food out of nothing. But emotionally, for the man who had built his entire identity around the idea that knowledge and effort could defeat death, this moment felt like a personal indictment. Later, he would help set up and support organizations to combat malnutrition, push for public health reforms, drive himself almost to collapse. But in 1943, as famine claimed perhaps 3 million lives in Bengal, he also understood something darker, that incompetence and arrogance in high office could kill on a scale no disease ever had. This understanding hardened into a new determination. If medicine had taught him to think in terms of individual patients, politics was now forcing him to think in populations, entire districts, provinces, nations. And whoever controlled the levers of power in those spaces could save or doom more people in one decision than he could in a lifetime of surgeries. Which meant that simply being a respected congressman, a sharp voice in the council, was no longer enough. He had to get closer to the center of decision-making. He rose quietly but steadily within the party. Gandhi trusted his integrity. Nehru valued his administrative clarity. Sardar Patel appreciated his no-nonsense approach. As internal rivalries, egos, and regional loyalties shook the Congress, like monsoon winds shake a banyan tree, Roy often played the role of the strong, nearly invisible root, stabilizing, advising, mediating. And all the while, another figure was rising in Bengal, with a different temperament, a different prescription for the provinces, illnesses, and a very different vision of its future, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. If Roy was the soft-spoken surgeon, Mukherjee was the fiery orator. Younger by nearly 2 decades, born into privilege as the son of the legendary Ashutosh Mukherjee, he became vice-chancellor of Calcutta University at an age when most men were still finding their first gray hair. Brilliant, articulate, unapologetically Hindu in his political identity, he gravitated towards the Hindu Mahasabha, suspicious of both Muslim League ambitions and what he saw as Congress's excessive faith in compromise. In some rooms, the two men were still allies, Bengalis who wanted their province to prosper, who opposed British arrogance. But beneath the surface, fault lines were forming. Where Roy believed communal harmony was a fragile, essential ligament holding Bengal together, Mukherjee increasingly believed that only a strong Hindu-majority province could guarantee security for his community. Where Roy's instinct was to negotiate, to build institutions that might dilute hatred over time, Mukherjee's was to draw clear, hard lines. The rivalry was not yet a shouting match across a table. It was something more dangerous. A slow divergence of paths that would, under the pressure of history, yank Bengal in 2 directions. History applied that pressure in 1946. Direct Action Day. The Muslim League, frustrated by stalled negotiations over Pakistan, called for mass mobilization. In Calcutta, under Muslim League Premier Hussain Shahid Suhrawardi, the streets turned into a theater of horror. What began as political demonstration exploded into communal riots. Hindus and Muslims who had lived side by side in crowded neighborhoods for generations now hunted each other with knives, sticks, fire. Official figures spoke of thousands dead. Unofficially, the number was worse. Roy moved through hospitals and relief camps, through temporary morgues where the air smelled of burnt flesh and formalins, to treat a man whose skull had been cracked by a brick and then listen to him, half conscious, still muttering the name of the community he hated. This was a new kind of sickness altogether. And in the political arena, battle lines hardened. Mukherjee blamed Suhrawardy's ministry and pushed the demand that if India was to be partitioned, then so must Bengal, to create a Hindu-majority West Bengal that would remain in India, leaving a Muslim-majority East Bengal to Pakistan. For him, this was protection. Roy recoiled from the idea, at least initially. To him, Bengal was not numbers on a communal ledger. It was a living organism. Rivers that did not know religion, cultures, and cuisines woven through centuries of coexistence. He believed that partition would be like amputating a limb in panic, leaving the patient maimed forever. He, along with leaders like Sarat Chandra Bose, searched for pathways to keep Bengal united within a free, federated India. There were proposals, negotiations, feverish letters. For a tense few weeks in 1947, it seemed that a united Bengal might actually emerge as an independent entity, neither entirely in India nor Pakistan, a kind of neutral bridge. The twist came quickly and brutally. Both the Congress High Command and the Muslim League, for very different reasons, began to back away from the idea. Nehru and Patel feared a large, unstable, ambiguous Bengal drifting between India and Pakistan, possibly pulling away altogether. Jinnah saw more advantage in a cleanly Muslim-majority East Bengal within Pakistan than in sharing influence over a tricky mixed province. At the same time, on the streets, memories of famine and riots made many ordinary Hindus in western Bengal more receptive to Mukherjee. As argument, partition, however painful, might be the only way to avoid permanent second-class status in a united province dominated by Muslim-majority districts. Roy's dream of a healed, undivided Bengal was collapsing under the weight of cold arithmetic and hotter fears. So he did something that reveals the harsh pragmatism beneath his gentle manner. He changed strategy. If partition was becoming inevitable, then his new duty, as he saw it, was to ensure that Calcutta, the brain and heartbeat of Bengal, did not slip into Pakistan. The city was geographically closer to many Muslim-majority districts than some Hindu-majority outlying areas. There were genuine doubts about where the Radcliffe line would fall. Roy threw himself into a frenzied last-minute campaign, gathering demographic data, maps, economic arguments. He traveled, lobbied, argued in Delhi and London, pressed upon Congress leaders, British officials, anyone who would listen, the same message. Without Calcutta, an Indian West Bengal would be a body without a head. Here, his old enemy, time, reappeared with a vengeance. The British had set a deadline. Power would be transferred on a fixed date. Cyril Radcliffe, the English lawyer drawing the border, had never set foot in Bengal before and had just weeks to decide the fate of millions. Files crossed desks faster than monsoon lightning. Decisions that would determine whether a village woke up in India or Pakistan were being made by men who would never see those villages. Roy worked with the manic intensity of a man in an emergency surgery, knowing there was only one chance to clamp the right artery. Somewhere in that blur of negotiations, cables, and map rooms, he succeeded. When the line was finally announced, Calcutta was on the Indian side. He had saved the city, but Bengal, as he had known it, was gone. On 15th August 1947, as tricolors rose against the sky and crowds shouted, "Vande Mataram," with tears streaming down their faces, trains from the New East Pakistan began to arrive in Sealdah and Howrah. They were not filled with tourists or traders. They were filled with refugees, dazed, dispossessed, clutching bundles and children, leaving behind homes, land, memories, entire ancestral worlds. West Bengal, the truncated province birthed in the same hour as independent India, was not born healthy. It was born traumatized, underfed, overcrowded, politically volatile, economically fragile. Its new capital, Calcutta, was both its greatest asset and its greatest emergency ward. Someone would have to run this emergency ward. In 1948, the Congress leadership turned to the man who had saved Calcutta on paper and soothed its wounds in person for decades. Bidhan Chandra Roy was asked to become the chief minister, the premier of West Bengal. He did not grab the post. He hesitated. At 66, he was no longer the tireless young surgeon racing between operating theaters and council halls. His heart had already given him warnings. Friends urged him to think of his health, of the long, quiet retirement he had more than earned. But when he looked out at the refugee camps spreading like raw wounds across the outskirts of Calcutta, at the shanties climbing up, against the old colonial facades, at the files piled high on government desks waiting for someone to take responsibility, the decision became brutally simple. The patient was on the table. There was no time to waste. He accepted. His rival, Syama Prasad Mukherjee, now chose a different battlefield, first as a minister in the central cabinet in Delhi, then as a critic of Nehru's policies, eventually as the founder of a new opposition party. Their contest was no longer just about where to draw a border. It was about what kind of state West Bengal would become and what kind of India it would inhabit. Centralized or more autonomous, secular or more openly majoritarian, socialist-inclined or business-driven, the stage was set. A man who had once fought invisible ceilings in London hospitals now sat under the slowly turning fans of the Writers' Building, the red brick nerve center of West Bengal's government, staring at a map of a broken province. He had 5 years, maybe 10 at best, before age and illness would begin to write their own decrees on his body. In those years, he would have to perform a miracle surgery to turn a bleeding, frightened, fragmented land into something resembling a functioning state, build cities, rehouse millions, attract industry, soothe communal scars, and somehow outpace a ruthless competitor, not just in Delhi but in history itself. The clock, which had once ticked quietly over his student desk in Patna, was now booming in his ears. The doctor had finally taken charge of the hospital. And outside the office windows, 11 million heartbeats in Calcutta and beyond were unconsciously syncing themselves to the rhythm of his next move. They thought independence would sound like drums and conch shells, like speeches on flower-decked stages. For Bidhan Chandra Roy, it began with a different sound. The low, endless murmur of 11 million people queued outside an invisible clinic, all demanding the same impossible prescription: make this broken land live again, and do it fast. From his office in the Writers' Building, he looked out not on triumph, but on a mess no textbook had prepared him for. Calcutta's proud avenues, once promenades for colonials, were now clogged with handcarts and refugee families sleeping under tarpaulins. The city's elegant lakes were ringed by shacks made of stolen tin and bamboo. Trains unloaded yet more people every day, men with nothing but a certificate in a rusting tin box, women holding keys to houses they would never see again, children clutching school books from schools that now lay across a hostile border. The British had left behind a neat line on a map and a mountain of unpaid bills. Roy began, as always, with diagnosis. He spread maps of West Bengal on the table, the truncated geography like a torn limb. No jute fields of East Bengal, no rice bowl districts that had once fed the cities. The countryside around Calcutta was already crowded, its villages barely feeding themselves. Where in this shrunken province could he fit the human tidal wave still pouring in? His secretaries waited for declarations, grand slogans. Instead, he murmured like a man counting a pulse. How many families can 1 square mile hold before it stops being a neighborhood and becomes a slum? He called in engineers, town planners, revenue officers, even old colleagues from medical circles who had turned administrators. "Don't tell me what we can't do," he snapped at one meeting, voice still soft but edged with steel. "Tell me where we can put people. On rail land, on marshland, on land nobody has wanted for 100 years. Because now we want it." The first brutal discovery: there was no way to simply send them back. These refugees had burnt their bridges behind them, sometimes literally as communal fires consumed their villages. They were West Bengal's responsibility now, his responsibility. So he made a decision that would define his years in office. If the old Bengal was gone, he would build a new one, not in poetry, in brick, steel, and poured concrete. On the outskirts of Calcutta lay a swamp the British had barely bothered with, a shimmering, salty expanse where the city's sewage ran out to die under the sun. Locals knew it as Salt Lake, a place of mosquitoes and bad smells. Roy stood there one early morning, the mud sucking at his sandals. Around him, officials shifted unhappily. The land seemed to reject the very idea of human settlement. "What do you see?" someone finally asked him. He stared at the sluggish water, at the horizon where the sun was slowly clawing its way up. "I see a neighborhood," he said quietly. "Wide roads, parks, schools, houses with light and air. A place that tells those who lost everything that they are not permanent beggars, but citizens again." They thought he was dreaming. He was, but it was a very specific kind of dream, the sort that came with blueprints and budgets attached. Over the next years, the swamp began to vanish under truckloads of soil. Dikes rose, drains were carved, roads were drawn in chalk, then in gravel, then in asphalt. Survey pegs turned into foundations. Foundations turned into houses. The planners wanted to name it simply Salt Lake Township. Bengal had other ideas. The city would be called Bidhanagar, Bidhan's town. It was not his only experiment. North of Calcutta, he saw an opportunity in old wartime infrastructure. Abandoned barracks, airstrips, land once used by American troops. Why not recycle the skeleton of war into a living town? There he planned Kalyani, a new urban center with tree-lined avenues, research institutes, housing blocks, a hospital complex. On barren laterite plains further away, he pushed for an industrial town, Durgapur, anchored by a steel plant that would one day light. Furnaces and homes across India. He began to speak in strange hybrid sentences, half medical, half engineering. "We must create new lungs for this state," he would say, pointing to maps. "Calcutta will choke if it is the only organ doing all the breathing. We need satellite towns, industrial zones, university hubs. Otherwise, this patient will collapse under its own weight." But while he tried to grow new organs, the existing body was still hemorrhaging. Refugee camps multiplied. Barakpur, Dum-Dum, Jadavpur, Garia, scattered across the fringes of the city like raw, angry scars. Tents gave way to thatched roofs, thatch to tin, tin to brick, not always legally. Busties spread along canals, railway lines, temple lands. Every attempt by the government to clear encroachments risked igniting fury among families who had already lost everything once. His critics, especially those aligned with the left and with Syama Prasad Mukherjee's camp, saw an opening. "Congress has money for showpiece townships," they shouted in rallies, "but not for the people sleeping under its very shadow." Mukherjee, now a national figure and founder of a new party challenging Congress, wielded the refugee issue like a scalpel of his own. From podiums, he accused the government of timidity with Pakistan, of abandoning Hindus in East Bengal, of failing to offer dignity to those who had fled. "Ask Dr. Roy," he thundered in one speech, "whether he would accept for himself the house he is giving to a refugee." The words flew back to Calcutta like poisoned arrows. Roy read the reports and felt the pressure tighten. This was not an abstract contest over ideology. It was a duel fought in the alleys of Sealdah and the queues outside ration shops. If he failed, Mukherjee's vision of a harder, angrier politics would gain more believers every day. He responded not with counter-slogans but with more work. He pushed through housing schemes, sometimes browbeating reluctant bureaucrats, sometimes charming hardened contractors into shaving profits to meet impossible budgets. He created development authorities, water boards, housing boards, dull-sounding bodies that, in his mind, were the bones on which the new flesh of Bengal would grow. In between, he remained stubbornly a doctor. He visited hospitals unannounced, walking the wards with a stethoscope casually looped in his pocket, chatting with patients in Bengali, English sometimes in halting Hindi. Nurses whispered as he examined charts more carefully than some junior physicians. This dual life sometimes produced moments almost surreal. One night, after 16 hours of meetings on industrial policy and refugee rehabilitation, he was called from home. A senior civil servant had collapsed with chest pain. The chief minister walked into the hospital in simple white dhoti and shawl and without ceremony took charge of the case. For 30 minutes, he was not the head of government, but the old precise clinician of Campbell and St. Bartholomew's, issuing quiet instructions, adjusting doses, watching the color drain back into a man's face. "Thank you, sir," the patient whispered weakly. Roy shook his head. "You'll thank me when you get back to work. We still have too much to do. Too much to do and not enough time." His own body had begun to send warnings. Occasional tightness in the chest, fatigue that clung like a second skin. Friends urged him to slow down, to delegate. to treat himself with the same seriousness he demanded for every public health issue, he smiled them away. West Bengal cannot afford a convalescent chief minister, he said. I'll rest when the state does. History, indifferent to his schedule, kept throwing him new emergencies. Floods in the districts washed away embankments and crops. There were fresh communal tensions as reports of atrocities trickled in from across the border, stirring anger among those who still had relatives there. Communist organizers, brilliant and tireless, moved through factories and busties, pointing to every uncollected garbage heap, every half-finished road, every jobless youth as proof that the Congress prescription was failing. In the Legislative Assembly, opposition benches grew more confident. On Calcutta's walls, hand-painted posters denounced food hoarders, black marketeers, and yes, the doctor in the writers' building. The rivalry with Mukherjee, already intense, took a sharp twist in 1953. Mukherjee, opposing the special status granted to Jammu and Kashmir, traveled there in defiance of entry rules. Arrested, he died in custody under circumstances that remain debated even today. The news hit Roy like an unexpected blow. They had never been friends in the easy sense. Their debates had sometimes been bitter, their visions of India and Bengal diverging wider each year. And yet, in the sparring of those long years, each had defined himself partly against the other. Now, one side of that argument was suddenly irrevocably silent. Some in Congress breathed easier. One powerful critic of Nehru and the Bengal government was gone. Roy, characteristically, did not celebrate. At a closed-door meeting, he said only this: "When strong voices die, we must listen more carefully, not less, to the whispers left behind. They tell us where we have not yet done enough." But grief did not grant him any extension on his deadlines. The 5-year plans rolled on, each with targets that looked tidy in Delhi and impossible in Calcutta: steel production, power generation, foreign exchange, graphs and tables that nonetheless fell in the end on his desk as demands: provide land, move people, pacify unions, keep investors and ideologues from tearing each other apart. He negotiated with industrialists in the morning and with striking workers in the afternoon, sometimes infuriating both in a single day. "You are too soft on capital," left leaders told him. "You are strangling enterprise with regulation," business owners complained. He replied again and again with the image he carried in his head. "A body needs both heart and hands," he said. "If either stops, the other cannot work. I will not let Bengal's heart stop. I will also not let its hands be chained forever to poverty." And yet poverty was not a metaphor. It was a daily riot waiting to happen. By the late 1950s, food prices were climbing. The state, still dependent on grain from elsewhere, struggled to ensure fair distribution. Ration lines grew longer, tempers shorter. In 1959, storm clouds finally broke. Calcutta woke one morning to see processions snaking through its streets. Workers, students, housewives shouting the same desperate demand: "Food! We want food!" It was not an abstract slogan. Kitchens were empty. Rice, when available, was beyond reach for many. The demonstrations swelled, blocking roads surrounding government buildings. In some places, anger spilled into stone throwing, into clashes with the police. The city, which Roy had tried to reshape into an orderly network of neighborhoods and offices and factories, began to feel again like a volcano whose crust was cracking. He faced a choice that no textbook of ethics had framed for him: allow the protest to spiral, risking deaths in stampedes, lootings, counter-violence, or allow the police to use force, knowing exactly what a bullet does to human flesh. Orders were given. Lothus rose and fell. Tear gas curled through alleys and across tram tracks. In some places, shots were fired. By nightfall, bodies lay on Calcutta's streets once more, not victims of famine or communal riots this time, but of an independent, state's-own security forces. The newspapers the next day were brutal. Cartoons showed a stethoscope dripping blood. Opposition leaders called for his resignation. The left accused him of showing his true colors as an instrument of bourgeois power. Old patients who had once told stories of the gentle doctor who saved their child now asked in anger, how could he? He did not defend himself in public with passion. He spoke of law and order, of unfortunate excesses, of inquiries, the official language of damage control. In private, the man who had once watched a child starve to death in his arms during the famine now read the casualty lists with the grim eye of a surgeon reading a failed operation report. He slept even less after that. And still he went on building. Hospitals rose, for women, for children, for specialized treatment of cancer and tuberculosis. Medical colleges expanded. He encouraged young doctors to stay in India, in Bengal, instead of chasing careers in Britain or America. Go abroad to learn, he told them in convocation speeches, but come back to serve. Your country is the largest patient you will ever have. Do not abandon it on the operating table. He courted scholars like P.C. Mahalanobis at the Indian Statistical Institute, seeing in their work not just mathematics, but the tools to predict and prevent future disasters. Numbers, properly understood, could be another kind of stethoscope. He coaxed, persuaded, bullied Calcutta's chaotic municipal systems into slow, grudging modernization, new water pipes, waste disposal, a road widening, tramline rationalization. Individual projects were unglamorous, the sort of thing no statue is ever built for. And yet without them, the city would simply have ground to a halt. If you walked through Calcutta in those years, you could feel the contradictions under your feet. In one lane, men hammered girders for a new factory that would export steel to the world. In the next, a child dug through a garbage heap for something to eat. In one direction, you saw the clean lines of a new township, with playgrounds and streetlights that actually worked. In another, the tangled filth of a refugee lane where 7 people slept in a space meant for 2. To some, this was proof that Roy's grand plans were cosmetic, islands of order in an ocean of neglect. To him, it was something else. Evidence that surgery on a living body is always messy. You stop one source of bleeding, another opens. You stabilize one organ, another falters. The miracle is not in achieving perfection, but in keeping the whole organism alive long enough for deeper healing to begin. Recognition came, even as criticism sharpened. In 1961, the government of India conferred on him the Bharat Ratna, the country's highest civilian honor. The citation spoke of his role in the freedom struggle, his medical service, his transformation of West Bengal. At the ceremony, under the chandeliers of Rashtrapati Bhavan, he looked almost out of place, spare, slightly stooped, a simple clad Bengali doctor among rows of uniforms and silk saris. Nehru, his friend and sometimes sparring partner, embraced him with obvious warmth. Yet even as the medal rested against his chest, beneath it his heart was misfiring. He had begun, in snatched private moments, to measure his life in terms he had once used only for patience. How many good years, how many tolerant months, how many dangerous weeks remained. The rivalry with the ghost of Syama Prasad Mukherjee, that alternative path for Bengal and India, no longer came in shouted speeches. It came in whispers from the future. Would his secular institution-building bandage and brick approach hold once he and Nehru were gone? Or would later generations turn to harsher, simpler answers born of frustration with the messiness he had chosen over quick, brutal cleanups? He did not know. What he did know was that the clock, his oldest adversary, was now ticking not just in cabinet meetings, not just in development plans, but inside his own ribs. Every morning he rose before dawn, drank his tea in silence, and went to work as if nothing had changed. Files, meetings, inspections, hospital rounds, party discussions, negotiations with Delhi. From the outside, he looked almost eerily steady. From the inside, his days had become an extreme experiment he would never recommend to any other patient. How long can a failing heart keep driving an overworked body if the mind refuses to slow down? The man who had once stretched time in the operating theater was now trying to stretch his remaining years over an entire state. Some nights, long after his subordinates had gone home, a light still burned in one office of the writers' building. Inside, over maps smudged with years of handling, the architect of modern Bengal traced new lines. A road here, a factory there, an extension to a hospital, a school in some forgotten district. Outside, the city he had fought to save and reshape breathed unevenly but stubbornly in the dark. He knew with the unsentimental clarity of a physician that he would not be there to see whether all of it, the townships rising, from swamps, the factories roaring to life on red dust, the hospitals crammed with equipment he had fought for, rupee by rupee, would finally knit into a healthy whole. His task was simpler, harsher, and bound by a clock no government could extend. Keep the patient alive, by Bengal time. Time for a generation of children, raised not on famine and partition, but on schools and vaccines, to grow into adults who could take over the work, Somewhere in that calculation, he accepted a quiet, unspectacular trade. His remaining years for their future decades. It was a bargain written not in ink, but in heartbeat intervals, each one carrying him closer to the moment when the doctor, at last, would have to step away from the operating table. They say good doctors never tell a patient the exact day they might die. Bidhan Chandra Roy did something more reckless. He circled a date on the calendar for his own exit, 1st July 1962, and then tried to cram an unfinished state into the shrinking space. Between that day and his failing heart, he did not announce it to the crowds. There were no grand farewells, no public countdown. The clock started ticking in a quiet room in New Delhi months earlier with a simple sentence, "I want to resign." Sitting across from him, Jawaharlal Nehru studied the familiar, tired face. The two men had aged together through freedom and famine and fractious cabinet meetings. Nehru had watched Roy carry Bengal like an overfull medical bag for more than a decade. "You have carried too much for too long," Nehru admitted. "But how do I replace you?" There was another worry, unspoken but heavy in the air. If the doctor stepped away, what would happen to the patient? Bengal was still running a fever. Refugee colonies had not yet settled into stable suburbs. The food problem flared and cooled but never really disappeared. The left grew stronger in mills and universities. The Janasangh and other right-wing forces sharpened their message in the lanes, where Syama Prasad Mukherjee's name was muttered like a prayer for a different kind of politics. Nehru leaned forward. "Stay just a little longer," he urged. "Till your 80th birthday. After that, we will both think of rest." It sounded like compromise. In truth, it was a deadline written straight onto Roy's pulse. He agreed, and so the last act of his life began, not with retirement, but with a final, brutal extension. Less than a year. 12 more months to finish what 3 decades had barely begun. 12 more months to lock into place the parts of Bengal that could not be allowed to crumble when he was no longer there to play emergency surgeon. The calendar, once a blur of meetings and inspections, changed meaning for him. Each page turned was no longer just another administrative month. It was 1/12 of his remaining promise to Nehru, 1/12 of his remaining argument with the ghost of Syama Prasad Mukherjee, whose Bengal would live on after him. From the outside, nothing seemed to slow. He still rose before dawn, in the half-light that softened the sharp outlines of Calcutta's old buildings. On some mornings, in the front room of his modest residence, there would already be a small crowd waiting. They did not come for the chief minister. They came for the doctor, a rickshaw puller with a hacking cough, a schoolteacher with a stubborn fever, a child with a swollen knee from a fall, people who had heard from somebody's cousin or neighbor that Dr. Roy still sees a few patients if you can get to his door very early. He examined them with the same careful fingers he once used in the hushed operating theaters of London. Pulse, tongue, eyes, a precise pressure here, a gentle question there. Sometimes he scribbled prescriptions. Sometimes he simply reassured a frightened mother that the fever would break. He charged nothing. Then, almost without transition, the private clinic would dissolve and the public theater would begin. Files would arrive, vehicles would line up, police escorts would take position. The same hands that had just checked a child's breathing would now sign orders for land acquisition, for factory licenses, for school construction. If you saw him only in those brief public moments, stepping out of a car in white dhoti kurta, walking up the red steps of the writers' building, you might have missed the slight catch in his gait, the way he sometimes rested his fingers against a wall for half a second longer than necessary while taking a corner. But the man who could read faint tremors in other people's hearts felt it clearly in his own. The engine that had pushed through partition, famine, riots, industrialization, food movements, and endless party intrigue was misfiring. There were nights when a simple climb of stairs left him breathing harder than he liked. There were mornings when the first sensation he felt was not the weight of Bengal's problems, but a dull ache behind the breastbone. He knew the textbook phrases: coronary insufficiency, myocardial strain. He refused still to behave like a patient. Instead, he behaved like a man racing himself. Every new hospital he inaugurated, a wing for cancer treatment here, a specialist institute for mental health there, was not just a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was a box he could mentally tick off on a long, invisible checklist titled, "Before I Go." Every small college he lifted to university status, every feeder road he pushed through from a village to a market town, every nagging, a technical reform to the creaking municipal systems, Property tax reassessments, water supply zoning, drainage redesign felt like another stitch in a body that might otherwise split open the moment he put down the needle. His critics did not stop because he was old or unwell. If anything, they sensed opportunity. To the left, he had become the face of a tired Congress, the party of promises without revolution, of clinics without land reform, of townships without the smashing of class power. Young communists, fierce-eyed and idealistic, distributed leaflets near factory gates and college canteens. New cities will not erase old hunger, they wrote. You cannot plaster over injustice with concrete. On the other flank, Mukherjee's ideological heirs were busy raising their own banners. In cramped party offices, his framed portrait looked down on younger men sharpening more combative slogans. They spoke of a Bengal betrayed by softness, of refugees still living like ghosts, of an India that needed a firmer spine and a clearer religious identity. They did not hesitate to name Bidhan Chandra Roy as part of what had to be swept aside. In assembly debates and street corner speeches, you could hear always the same unspoken question under the noise. When the doctor is gone, will we finally get to try our cure? Roy heard it too. Not the words, but the direction of the wind. He had no illusions about immortality, especially in politics. Governments age faster than men. Administrations rot from the inside, not always from malice, but from the simple fatigue of those who have carried too much, too long. He was determined that when his own time ran out, some things would not depend on which party slogan won the next election. Hospitals, medical councils, universities, statutory boards for housing, power, water. A whole skeleton of law and institution that would be harder to tear apart than to keep using. They were not glamorous. They did not march or shout or dazzle. But they could, he believed, outlast every shouted slogan painted on every wall. Sometimes, late in the evening, you could find him walking slowly through the corridors of a new building before its official opening. An outpatient department with shiny tiles, a residential block for junior doctors, a laboratory whose benches still smelled of fresh varnish. He would trail his hand along a windowsill, check the ventilation, glance at the taps and drainage. Why bother with such small things? An impatient young administrator once asked, half admiring, half exasperated, "You are the chief minister. Leave it to us." Roy looked at the man with a mixture of amusement and something firmer. "The small things," he said, "are where the patient lives or dies. If a tap did not work, if a corridor trapped heat, if a ward flooded in monsoon, those were the points at which ordinary people decided whether the state cared about them or not. Whether these new buildings were monuments for Inauguration Day photographs or living organs in a functioning body. He was, to the end, obsessed not with grandeur, but with whether the stitches would hold when he was gone. The pressure from Delhi did not ease. Every 5-year plan brought new targets, new negotiations. Bengal needed more power for its factories, more credit for its industries, more wagons for its coal and steel. Other states pushed just as hard. Chief ministers jostled for central attention like tired but relentless relatives at the bedside of a shared, complicated inheritance. In those gatherings, Roy's rivalry with Syama Prasad Mukherjee took on a strange second life. Mukherjee was now a martyr figure for a different India, his death in Kashmir woven into a story of betrayal and sacrifice. His followers used his name to question everything Nehru and his allies stood for: secularism, special statuses, compromises with diversity. Roy could feel the tug of that alternate path every time a hardliner in Delhi or in Calcutta spoke of simple solutions to knotty problems: mass expulsions instead of rehabilitation, emergency rule instead of messy negotiations, lines drawn not just on maps but through neighborhoods and families. The contrast between them, the surgeon who believed in complex incremental repair and the orator whose death was claimed as proof, that complexity itself was cowardice, sharpened with time. Which memory would prove more seductive to the generations to come? The doctor hunched over drainage diagrams or the leader whose portrait now hung wreathed in marigolds at fiery rallies? Roy could not answer that. He could only keep building drains. By early 1962, the private clock and the public clock were almost perfectly aligned. His chest pains had become more frequent. Trusted colleagues and juniors worried openly. Some urged him to seek treatment abroad, to let specialists in London or New York evaluate his heart. He declined. "I have spent my life asking young doctors not to run away from India's sickest patient," he told one of them with no reporters present. How can I fly away when I am finally in the same ward? Instead, he allowed only the most minimal concessions, a slightly lighter schedule on some days, a few more files delegated. A car kept waiting a little closer to the exit. But he refused the one concession that might have extended his life, stepping away fully and early from the load he carried. The date loomed closer. Some days when he looked at the city from the car window, it was as if he saw two Calcuttas at once. One was the place he had inherited, cramped, diseased, haunted by famine and empire, its sewage flowing into forgotten swamps. The other was the place he had tried to carve out of that inheritance. New neighborhoods where refugees sent their children to school, instead of to relief lines, industrial belts where furnaces glowed orange against the night, quiet hospital wards where a cancer diagnosis was no longer an immediate death sentence but the beginning of a fight. The two cities overlapped like double exposure on an old film reel, one fading, one still too faint to be trusted. He had perhaps bought Bengal time. He had not been able to buy its certainty. In March, April, May, the heat pressed down on the overcrowded streets. The political temperature, thankfully, stayed lower than in the volatile autumns of previous years. No great riot, no dramatic protest movement erupted to hijack his last stretch in office. It was not peace. It was merely the exhausted truce of a city that had shouted itself hoarse for too many years. In some darkly humorous corner of his mind, the doctor in him recognized the pattern. After a long crisis, the body often appears deceptively calm right before something decisive happens. On the morning of 1st July 1962, Calcutta woke as it did on every humid, sticky monsoon season day. Milk vendors clattered down lanes. Tram bells clanged. In the new townships he had built on reclaimed earth, sleepy children in freshly washed uniforms prepared for school. In the older quarters, shopkeepers rolled up shutters with the habitual weariness of men who had done the same thing for decades. In one modest house, on a side street not far from the centers of power, it was the birthday of an 80-year-old man who had long ago grown indifferent to celebrations. There were, of course, the expected formalities. Bouquets sent by colleagues, a few carefully worded telegrams from Delhi, calls from party workers. The polite flurry of many happy returns that never quite sits well on someone whose life has been spent watching the odds of any return at all. He had one more commitment. A few patients who had somehow secured promises of early morning consultation on that very day. 80 years old, head of government, Bharat Ratna laureate. And still, in that corner room, he leaned forward in his simple wooden chair and listened intently to a young man's complaint of breathlessness and a woman's description of dizziness. The stethoscope's disc was cool against their skin. If you had paused the clock right there, that instant when his fingers rested on a stranger's wrist, feeling for the rhythm of life, you would have seen the whole paradox of Bidhan Chandra Roy, a man with absolute power over files and budgets, spending his last personal reserves on the smallest, most private act of care. But the clock did not pause. As the hours moved, something invisible finally claimed the attention he had refused it for years. The patient whose chart he had stubbornly ignored had come to collect his bill. Sometime around midday, the details are blurred by shock in the memories of those who were there. The pain in his chest stopped, being a warning, and became an event. Not a twinge, not a fleeting tightness, but a crushing, undeniable weight. The textbook words he knew so well rearranged themselves into his own diagnosis. Heart attack. There is a cruel symmetry that storytellers sometimes overplay and historians distrust. In his case, it was simply true. On the day he had agreed to accept as the outer limit of his service, the day he turned 80, the day his resignation was to become effective, his heart stopped. Born 1st July 1882, died 1st July 1962. A perfect circle, closed with the precision of a surgeon's knot. News in Calcutta traveled faster than official communiques. Before radio announcements, before headlines hit the streets, the message ran along telephone lines and across verandas from Payan, shop to tram conductor to office clerk. Dr. Roy is dead. The city froze, then moved as if in a dream. Shops shuttered not by order but by instinct. Trams ran nearly empty as conductors abandoned their posts to join the swelling crowd. From busty lanes and new colony blocks, from elite clubs and factory canteens, people drifted toward the heart of the city. They came from refugee colonies he had legalized with the stroke of a pen, From hospitals where a plaque with his name hung unnoticed in a corner, from office buildings whose lifts had never worked properly but whose foundations he had insisted meet safety codes. Some had cursed him during the food movements, had shaken fists at his portrait when police Lothis rained on their backs. Now they stood in silence as his body, wrapped in the tricolor, was taken on its final journey through streets he had widened, past lampposts he had fought budgets to install, under the cables of electrification projects he had pushed through hostile committees. Among the official mourners, ministers, judges, senior bureaucrats, there were also men who had once denounced him in assembly speeches, and women who had voted against his party. Death, for a moment, stripped ideology down to the bare recognition of what it meant for a human being to spend his entire adult life on other people's crises. The funeral pyre burned, the ash scattered. The rivalry with Syama Prasad Mukherjee did not end there. It migrated fully into memory. In the decades that followed, Bengal and India changed in ways neither man could have fully predicted. The left, nurtured in the years when Roy clashed with them over strikes and land, would one day rule the state for an unbroken stretch. That made his own 15-year tenure look brief. They would inherit his townships, his industrial corridors, his hospitals, sometimes denouncing them as imperfect, sometimes extending them, always using in some form the bones he had laid down. The forces that claimed Mukherjee, first Jana Sangh, later broader currents of Hindu nationalism, would grow from the margins into the mainstream. They would look back on him as a pioneer, on his death as proof of their narrative, and on Nehru and his allies with increasing hostility. Walk into different political offices in Kolkata now, and you will see the two men framed in different corners of the same historical argument. In one, a photograph of Bidhan Chandra Roy garlanded on 1st July every year, his face invoked as shorthand for sober, secular, service-oriented politics. In another, a portrait of Syama Prasad Mukherjee, honored as the uncompromising nationalist, the man who refused special statuses and soft borders. Ask in a tea stall where old men argue over newspapers whose Bengal won, and you will not get a simple answer. The refugee colonies Roy regularized became fiercely politicized battlegrounds. The smokestacks he raised sometimes belched wealth, sometimes unemployment. The institutions he built have known both excellence and decay, and yet beneath the noise some legacies are obstinately clear. Every time a child is born in a government maternity hospital in Kolkata, every time a teenage scholarship student arrives in Durgapur to study engineering, every time a cancer patient in a state-run ward lives a few more years because of a treatment protocol established decades ago, the invisible hand on their shoulder belongs partly to the man who saw a swamp and imagined streets. India chose to mark 1st July, the date he both entered and left the world, as National Doctors' Day. For one day each year, ministers give speeches about the nobility of medicine. Flower bouquets are carried to statues most people pass without noticing on other days. Young doctors share photographs on social media, half ironical, half proud. Very few of the patients who stream into overcrowded OPDs stop to think that the date on the wall calendar is tied to a thin, bespectacled Bengali who once examined strangers for free at dawn and signed files till midnight. But if you listen carefully beneath the speeches and the statistics, you can almost hear the undertone of the older, harsher promise he made to himself and never fully spoke aloud. Keep the patient alive. India, the impossible patient, poor, quarrelsome, magnificent, endlessly falling sick and endlessly refusing to die. West Bengal, the complicated limb, scarred by partition, prone to fevers of ideology, but still walking, still working, still sending blood and ideas back into the national bloodstream. In the grand ledger of history, with its wars and coups and revolutions, the work of men like Bidhan Chandra Roy can look almost modest. No empire toppled, no thunderous declaration reshaped the globe. Just a doctor who became a politician and then tried stubbornly to keep doing medicine by other means. His operations were roads, townships, laws, councils. His surgical tools were files and budget notes rather than scalpels. His operating theater was a restless, angry state that never really slept. He lost battles against famine, against communal hatred, against the brutal mathematics of poverty. Some of his decisions, like the orders that led to blood on Calcutta's streets in 1959, will haunt his reputation as long as his statues stand. But the body he was responsible for did not die on his table. That, in the end, was the only success he truly believed in. The clock he could not stop is silent now. The cities he raised from mud still hum with traffic. The hospitals whose corridors he paced still smell of antiseptic and fear and hope. The debates he sharpened with Mukherjee still echo in newer, louder forms. Somewhere between the ghost of the doctor in a white dhoti and the roar of a 21st century megacity, the question he spent, his life answering, is still being asked, every day, in every waiting room and polling booth. How do you heal a place when the disease is not in its blood or bones alone, but in its memories, its inequalities, its very idea of itself? Bidhan Chandra Roy did not find a cure. He did something messier and in some ways braver. He gave the patient time, one more decade, then another, to keep looking.